everyone, I'm Stephanie Arell, and today I'm going to be talking to you about what happens when shame goes unaddressed. If you recall watching the video before this, we talk a lot about thinking about shame as distinguished from guilt and as having to do with a perception that something's wrong with myself. Another way to articulate that is to think about shame in terms of believing that I have something wrong with me that's related to my own worth, so that my feelings are that I am not worthy of someone or something. So that's the shame experience, right? I believe that I am not worthy of love or goodness or somebody's trust, for instance, and things happen when I don't have this sense of security and trust and worth in myself. So what are those things? A scholar named Thomas Scheff developed a theory which I think works in relationship to thinking about shame, is that the shame that goes unaddressed participates in a cycle of perpetuated shame, so that's shame equals more shame, or alternatively rage and violence. What happens is that shame, or this feeling of feeling worthless, turns into compounded shame, so my continuing to feel more and more shame, or alternatively, my ability to enact violence on the self or on others. That then leads to more shame, so that there is this kind of endless cycle between shame and more shame, or alternatively shame, violence, and therefore more shame. All right, what does that look like? How can we think about it? How can we interpret it differently in relationship to our own behaviors in the world? James Gilligan is another that works on the concept of shame, and James Gilligan wrote a book called Violence. What he's doing in his work is he's looking at the prison complex and people who are in prison, and he is not a supporter of the prison complex or the way that we have interpreted justice as it manifests in prisons. So just to get that out on the line, what he is looking at is what happens when violence erupts in situations that are already underscored with levels of violence. He particularly draws upon experiences of men in prison who say, I reacted in such a way, I reacted violently because I felt dissed. One of the arguments Gilligan makes is that the feeling of being dismissed or communicated to that you don't have worth perpetuates shame, and that is a very powerful undercurrent in the manifestation of violence towards other people. It's really important to think about in terms of the way our systems work, because if we enact shame on other people, it's almost as if we're laying the ground for opportunities of escalated violence. So if we characterize shame as this lowered sense of self-worth, and we understand shame as our withdrawal from engaging with other people because of a perpetuated or underlying sense of diminished worth, then we understand that if we don't put ourselves around people, if we don't create opportunities for connection and empathic exchange, in the next video I'm going to talk about empathy, if we don't do that, then what we're doing is adding on layers of our own shame, right? So what that might look like is someone who feels shameful about any given situation, they withdraw, they feel embarrassed, they don't want to reach out to another. And the withdrawal doesn't do anything to dismantle or disrupt the perception of lowered self-worth. And so that then there's a continued feeling of, I shouldn't participate, something's wrong with me, no one's going to love me. And so that becomes its own vicious cycle and interrupts people's capacity to really function in loving human relationships. So if we're talking about shame that turns into rage and becomes part of that cycle, what I want you to think about is that rage is not necessarily something that we take out on someone else. So violence and rage can be internally mobilized. For a while, I worked in an eating disorder hospital, and working with young women who have eating disorders supports my theory about this violence towards the self, because I think that controlling food in ways that are harmful to the body is a way of enacting violence on the self, and is in fact an evidence of deep shame. Other things that we can think about are efforts at hurting the self, whether that's with things that might mutilate the skin, whether that's taking very egregious risks, so really driving your car really fast with the intent or the imagination that there's a possibility that something bad might happen to you. These aren't that unusual of experiences, because shame really gets in there and tells us there's something wrong with us. And then it has to be enacted. It has to get out of the body in some way. And unless it's done in such a way where we're taking really deep care of ourselves, it can manifest into our own feelings of perpetuated shame or violence to ourselves in the forms that I've just articulated. It can also manifest in violence towards other people. And violence towards other people doesn't have to look like I'm gonna shoot somebody, right? Violence can be an internal talk that we say about someone else. Violence can be the way that we use language to hurt someone else. So we can think about what we do with our words that come from our own sense of lack that gets projected onto other people. And I also think it's worth thinking of the reverse, right? So if someone is attempting to shame you, likely comes out of their own shame. That's very complicated. It is not your responsibility to take care of someone else who's enacting violence on you in such a way where you can see that they're shamed, but it is important to understand that it's not about you. I think one of the big dangers with shame in terms of its relationship to rage and violence is that it can turn into a perpetuated and very harmful for multiple people involved cycle where the shame gets enacted as violence. That then causes more shame, which then perpetuates more violence. This can be talked about on individual levels. We can think about how we interact with ourselves and our friends. That can happen in family situations or in smaller communities. And it can be extrapolated to think about what's going on in politics and what has happened historically to populations that have felt shamed or violated in some way, and then use aggression as a response to that shameful experience. That is very complicated. If some of you are interested in learning more about that in terms of the larger, broader global dynamics around shame, there's a scholar named Vamik Volkan. He's a Turkish psychoanalyst, and he does a lot of work on historical violence in such a way. I do think it's the beginning. It's just scratching a little bit at the surface. There's more to be done, of course, but I think it's worth thinking about just in terms of trying to understand dynamic interplays. And also for me, the important thing is to take away what can I do for myself that pulls me out of these kind of systems, or helps me develop some kind of resistance to other people's efforts to creating my own disempowerment or my own diminished self-worth. I don't envision the world myself as happening like that, partially because I think I have done a lot of work on thinking about my own self-worth, and I do think that that's where it starts. So it's the idea that if I continue to love and nurture myself and really truly believe of my own capabilities in the world, that enables me to respond both to forms of violence and to other people's shame that may manifest in violence. It enables me to respond from a stronger place. It takes a lot of work to respond to others' efforts at shaming any person or community with a response that's grounded in the belief in self-worth. It also takes more than that, I think, and you guys might have ideas about what it takes. For instance, I think it takes some courage. It takes courage to be able to risk putting oneself in a situation where there might be diminishment, and then an additional kind of chutzpah to be able to resist internalizing that diminishment. I also think there are very real ways, physical, material ways, that people are diminished in our society. And so there's an additional question to be able to not have external resources but continue to develop internal self-worth. I do think that one of the greatest forms of resistance we can have to systems of oppression, for instance, is to develop deep sense of self-worth among people and communities.